Hello, everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to discuss Chapter 8, which covers case mix index and other useful topics you'll be seeing in health information management. This chapter deals with ways that we actually analyze healthcare data. In other words, we collect it and then we have to make decisions regarding it. So this will cover some things that we do that involve case mix index, RVUs, and other things. So again, as discussed, we'll talk about case mix index. We'll analyze this. We'll compare and contrast case mix measurement in both in and outpatient setting. And then we'll talk about a topic that may not be totally new to you about relative value unit analysis. Some of the exploratory data analysis that we use involves data mining, right? So basically we're collecting data, typically from an EHR system, and then we're using statistical techniques to find patterns. Who is our most frequent payer? What is the most frequent procedure done in a hospital setting? And again, some of these things that we'll get more into in terms of case mix index will help us analyze where our resources are going. HIM professionals have a unique perspective about this because they understand the healthcare data, understand both the limitations and the benefits of coded data, and also get the finer level detail about the link between coding and reimbursement. A case mix index is basically an average of the MSDRG weight for all patients. And we can parse this out and calculate it for patients such as Medicare, Medicaid, dual enrollment, all these different things. We may want to exclude certain outliers, such as, say, cardiac transplants, which are a very high weight MSDRG, because that skews our data. Or transfers, because we get reduced payment for transfers in short stays. Medicare case mix index is a primary driver of inpatient Medicare revenue. And often we use this as a performance indicator for a hospital and a driver of what kind of budget revenue a hospital will receive. So how do we calculate it? Basically, we get the number of cases in each MSDRG by their relative weight. We sum all these values. We sum the number of discharges, and then basically we divide these total relative weights by the number of discharges. And it's another type of an average. So you can see these calculations here. We can parse this out some more, right? And if you've taken our reimbursement class, then you realize that we have MSDRGs with either a major comorbidity complication or an MCC, a CC, and basically what this is allowing us to do is to assign a higher weight to those MSDRGs that have an MCC. And the thinking is these are more resource intensive hospital stays, ergo they should have more reimbursement. So this is where the rubber meets the road, right? So if we have the CC, MCC rate, we're taking the number of all these CC MSDRGs plus the number of MCCs MSDRGs, divide by all MSDRGs, and we get a percentage, right? So in this case, as you see in this bullet point over here, right, we have a volume of 87 with an MCC, MI with a CC 51, 33 without anything. So we have 87 and 51 will be the numerator. And then the denominator will include all the MSDRGs. And then we wind up with our 80.7%. And then if we want to, we can compare it to the HCUP data by using z-test for proportions and all of this. In general, with a few exceptions, hospitals that have a higher CC, MCC capture rate have a higher case mix index because it raises the average. An unusually high capture rate is indicative of perhaps overcoding. And this is something that we're very interested in, as we'd rather find it out at our local level within the hospital than have the OIG or an auditor catch it. Whenever we have a shift in the case mix index, we have something going on. These don't just happen. And these could be a lot of different things. This could be losing a surgeon. This could be a surgeon on vacation. This could be a natural disaster that brings in different things. This could be a new service line. All these things will affect the case mix index. And we talked about MSDRGs. That's the one that we always get obsessed with, but we have all payers and all payers refined, right? The New York Grouper. And you'll hear these things. And basically, there are other ways of using similar DRG groupings in the AP DRGs. This is all patient, all payer type of things for all patients. And we calculate these weights for everybody, not just Medicare. With the APR, it's all patient refined, right? And 3M, the encoder and DRG grouping software system, came up with this. And it's a 3-character numeric followed by digits 1 through 4 for severity and risk of mortality. APCs, like we talked about in reimbursement, are in some ways a different way of classification, but we're looking for ambulatory patient classifications. These classifications are used to pay for services that are in a hospital outpatient and ambulatory surgery center. And this can be challenging. One of the challenges is a claim may have more than one payable APC. The assignment of the CPT and HCPCS codes to APCs may change every year. And it's more of a fee schedule than a true prospective payment system. We can use APC weights, though, to calculate a service mix index. And again, this is another average, and this is measuring the average resource intensity for these types of hospital, outpatient, and ambulatory surgery center settings. So again, how do we do this? Well, we want to validate these utilization patterns. We want to look at the specific codes. And we want to compare it to a hospital with a similar service mix. So in other words, we want to take a small community hospital and compare it to a large academic medical center. The RVU analysis is kind of done similarly, right? And the RVU is basically a way that we can benchmark physician productivity, right? This is part of the CMS physician fee schedule, like we talk about in the reimbursement class. And there are different ways that you can calculate it, as illustrated here. And here's a hypothetical example out of the text. So we have Dr. West, who has worked RVUs of 2,173.39. He has had 1,139 encounters, done 2,248 procedures, right? And the worked RVU per FTE is 2,173.39, right? So again, this is a sticky wicket to discuss with physicians because it's basically looking at productivity, right? So when you look at Dr. Kenna, who's only a 40% FTE, they are the second most productive physician, again, because they're there half time. So all these things come into play when you look at physician productivity. And again, these RVUs are used for other things, right? Average cost per RVU, physician compensation per work RVU, malpractice expense per malpractice RVU, and break-even conversion factors. So a lot of use, especially as we're seeing more managed care organizations, we're seeing more large hospital groups. All these things are coming into play here. And that's all I have for you. Please stop by office hours or reach out to me if you have any questions about this material. Bye now.